Okay, thank you, Arjuna. So good evening, everyone, or good morning, wherever you're from or wherever you're based. And thank you for joining us on our monthly ICOMOS lectures. This is lecture evenings that we organize once a month, we being the ICOMOS Netherlands Lecture Committee. My name is Sophia Lovegrove, and together with Arjuna Kandotti, we will be running and moderating this talk. And as I said before we start, some small housekeeping information that I think you're all more than used to hearing by now. If you have questions, we'd like to ask you to use the chat. And we hope you do have lots of questions. And you can put these questions in the chat throughout the presentations and obviously also during the Q&As. And we'd like to ask you to please keep your microphones off, especially during the presentations, because it can be really annoying for the speakers if they start hearing some background noises. And Arjuna, could you share the screen with the program, please? Yes, I think it's nice and visible. So unfortunately, there's been a slight change of program. We had initially 3 speakers planned, but one speaker has had to cancel last minute due to personal reasons. So we had to adapt the program a little bit, and we apologize for that. And we will start by doing a little presentation, and then Sharon Willoughby will do the first presentation titled Inclusive Storytelling in the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. We'll have a short Q&A and then a break, and then we'll go on to the second presentation by Evie Evans on the nature of botanical gardens and museums. And then we'll have a longer Q&A after that, and then we'll hope to end around 9 p.m. Dutch or Central European time. And just to start off this lecture evening, I just wanted to share a few words about this topic. As the name of the event indicates, we will be talking about botanical gardens and collections and contemporary approaches for dealing with the connections between these spaces and these collections in the colonial past. Western science and natural history collections and botanical gardens are or seem to be increasingly being understood and studied from the perspective of the connections to the colonial past. To give a few examples, and particularly from our perspective or our standpoint in the Netherlands, in 2018, a conference was organized at the Artis Zoo in Amsterdam titled The Colonial Legacy of Dutch Natural History Collections. And in 2020, Frame organized an exhibition about this topic titled On the Nature of Botanical Gardens, which Evie will tell us more about. But still, it feels like in comparison to discussions taking place in museums about statues and monuments in the public space, places like botanical gardens and natural history collections seem to be having a bit less attention, or at least there seem to be a bit less in the spotlight. So we thought it would be a good idea to organize an event about this topic and to contribute a little bit to the ongoing work of scholars and professionals and others who are working on this topic. And so without further ado, we will start with the first presentation. I'll start maybe, Arjuna, if you could share the screen, then I'll say something about Sharon. So Dr. Sharon Willoughby is currently the head of interpretation at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew in the United Kingdom. Sharon has a background in ecological science and a dissertation focused on the garden scientific and environmental history of the Royal Botanic Gardens Cranbourne in Melbourne, Australia. Sharon worked for the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria between 1999 and 2016, where the focus of her work was interpretation, planning, placemaking, and community inclusion. Sharon is a member of the Decolonizing Kew working group formed in Kew in 2020. And Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see you all this evening for me. In order to tell you about my journey through storytelling in Botanic Gardens, I'd first like to share with you a little bit of the garden path that has brought me to working at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in London. Can I have the next picture, Arjuna? Thank you. I was born and grew up in Australia from 1999 to 2016. I worked for the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, and this is an aerial photograph of the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria's Melbourne Garden. It's in the heart of the city of Melbourne, right on the Yarra River. RBG Melbourne has been called a colonial garden as it was established in 1845, only 10 years after the colonisation of this place, the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people by the British Empire and others. In common with many botanic gardens built around this time, this garden landscape has elements of British gardens and the imagined tropics embedded in its otherwise Australian landscape. Next slide, please. From 2003 to 2016, I worked at the Royal Botanic Gardens Cranbourne, which is a satellite to RBG Melbourne, based some 45 minutes from Melbourne Gardens on the peri-urban fringe of the city. This is an aerial photograph of a new botanic garden that we built during that time called the Australian Garden. It's in an abandoned sand mine in the middle of 1,000 acres of remnant bushland on the traditional lands of the Bunurong peoples. I was responsible for the development and delivery of the information, art, interpretation and education framework. So all the channels through which we aim to tell deep and rich stories about Australian plants, peoples and places. The Australian Garden was first conceived of in the 1930s. Funding to purchase the land to build this garden didn't arrive until the 1970s. And the Australian Garden didn't open to the public until 2006. So you can see there was a very long period of gestation. And during that time, relationships and understandings between Indigenous and European Australians changed radically. When I started at RBG Victoria in 1999, Melbourne Gardens was just beginning a relationship with the local Indigenous community, with the employment of the first Aboriginal liaison officer. As the Australian Garden and relationship building with the local community progressed, storytelling from the Indigenous community began to shape the landscape itself and the stories that this garden told through programs, festivals, panels, and the landscape itself. I have the next slide. A great deal of my work focused on placemaking, interpretation and engagement planning for that Australian garden. I worked very closely with local communities, including the local Indigenous peoples, who taught me a great deal about co-production of content for storytelling and the power of authentic, genuine and culturally inclusive partnerships. It took any number of cultural missteps, and I must acknowledge how generous... Sorry, I'm getting feedback from someone's microphone. So I made any number of cultural mistakes during that time, and I have to acknowledge how generous and patient community elders were as I learnt and tried to decolonise my own thinking and work processes during that time. One of the most powerful lessons from that time was the idea of a continuum on which partnerships sit. A way of thinking about or assessing the partnerships and the knowledge sharing that you might undertake through those partnerships. If you can see on this slide, there's a continuum from information at the top through to community agency at the bottom. On the first rung of the continuum, you might see an organisation approach a community, gather information, and then go away and tell that story separately. A more authentic partnership might see partners deciding and acting together to tell those stories. Finally, it's about providing agency to community to tell their own stories, essentially operating as a bridge that allows the community to come in and tell their stories within the Botanic Gardens. I think of it as getting out of the community's way in a number of circumstances. On the slide, I've put 3 references that I found really key in completing this work. The first one is a publication that BGCI brought out in 2015 called Caring for Community, which talks quite a bit about this idea of a continuum of community engagement. But then there's the fabulous publication Creating Living Knowledge by Kerry Facer and Bryony Enright, which was published online in 2016. It's easy to find. But finally, Creating Change Through Partnerships by Snake in Australia in 2019 has really fabulous information about what authentic, culturally inclusive partnerships look like. Can I have the next slide, please? So that's the context or the background to my move in 2017 from Melbourne, Australia, to take up the role of Head of Interpretation at RBGQ. This is a lovely aerial photograph of Kew Gardens. It's a strong contrast to the colonial gardens at Melbourne, where I felt very much on the periphery of all things. Kew has its origins in the heart of the British Empire. Its ancient history lies in the creation of royal landscapes. And you can see in this image the band of the River Thames curling around the edge of the Thames. This region of London became a popular location for the elites of London who left London during seasonal plagues in the 16th and 17th century, relocating to this area of London. George III brought 2 of these estates together into one property in 1772, largely creating the present-day footprint of Kew Gardens. Kew was placed under state ownership as a botanic garden in 1831, with William Jackson Hooker as the first official director. As I started my new role at Kew, I knew that the history of Kew would be deeply entangled with the history of empire. And this is easier to understand during the Georgian period when Joseph Banks was the unofficial director. Lucille Brockway's Science and Colonial Expansion, which was written in 1979, and Richard Drayton's Nature's Government, Science, Imperial Britain and the Improvement of the World, published in 2000. And others have written about Kew's role as the centre of knowledge and plant exchange within the British Empire. But what this means through the 20th century and how does this impact today is to be discovered. Surprisingly, much of Kew's history is as yet unwritten, so it's difficult to be definitive about Kew's entanglement with empire. This is something that Kew is actively seeking to address. So in 2017, I come to London. I'm now working in a mega city with a collection of plants from every corner of the globe. 2,000 species of plants, 7 million preserved plant specimens, and 100,000 plant and fungal artifacts, surrounded by peoples from many of the former colonies. How do we make connections and meaning in this garden space? How can we add cultural diversity and richness to our storytelling? I really think this cultural richness needs to mirror the biological richness that we have on display at Kew, a biocultural diversity, if you like. So what would inclusive storytelling look like in this environment? Can I have the next slide, please? This is the Temperate House at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. The focus of my first year at Kew was the interpretation and planning and delivery for the Temperate House project. The Temperate House was built in 1859 and opened to the public for the first time in 1863. The focus of the storytelling in the newly refurbished Temperate House is rare and threatened plants and the current work of Kew Science. Engagement is delivered at Kew through a number of different programs: formal schools learning, outreach, programs on site, festivals, exhibitions in art galleries, sometimes exhibitions in the garden landscape. My role focuses on storytelling that happens on site through panels. The focus of the equity, diversity and inclusion work in the Temperate House really in that year focused on ensuring gender balance across stories, making sure that we represented both female and male Kew scientists, and acknowledging the partners that those scientists work with in other countries. This was a good step forward, but on the scale of engagement, this would sit quite low down with consultation. Can I have the next slide, please? But things are changing at Kew. Last month, Kew published a new corporate strategy called a Manifesto for Change to run from 2021 to 2030. And we have a new mission. Our mission is to understand, protect plants and fungi for the well-being of people and the future of all life on Earth. So a new manifesto for change and a new mission. Can I have the next slide, please? Our manifesto for change is split up into 5 key priorities, 2 of which provide important directions for how we will provide inclusive storytelling. You can see that the first priority is around the delivery of science-based knowledge and solutions. The second priority, inspire people to protect the natural world, is a key one for storytelling. Train the next generation of experts, which relates to Kew's educational role. Extend our reach. How can we extend the reach of Kew to reach communities that don't interact with Kew? That's an important one for storytelling. And finally, influence national and international opinion and policy. Can I have the next slide, please? So if we look at priority 4, which is extend our reach. In that priority, we flesh that out by saying, ensure the diverse countries, cultures that partners with RBGQ and contribute to our collections are accurately and equitably represented. We will move quickly to decolonise our collections, re-examining them to acknowledge and address any exploitative or racist legacies and develop new narratives around them. You can see on the slide that I've put a clip from a recent newspaper article, The Guardian in the UK, that features an image of our director, Richard Deverill. A couple of things happened at Kew. Kew released the Manifesto for Change. There was also a podcast that Kew generated that talked about equity, diversity, inclusion at Kew, and it generated an outpouring of reaction, both positive and negative. And you can see in this article that Richard Deverill is seeking to redress some of that outpouring of reaction. Can I have the next slide, please? So here we have an example of one of the ways that Kew has changed the way we share stories. In the photograph on the left is an example of the new agile interpretation that we're placing around both Kew Gardens and at our sister site, Wakehurst. Their aim is to tell breaking news stories. This photograph shows the first go that we had at the agile interpretation, which talks about a report that Kew published in 2020 called The State of the World's Plants and Fungi. It's a report that does a summary of the state of the world's plants and fungi. You can see on the panel that's represented at the bottom that we've acknowledged the many collaborators on this report from around the world that we've worked with. And in the pop-up, you can see that we've included quotes from our partners in other countries directly. So this is about opening up our storytelling so that it can be told through other diverse voices. Can I have the next slide, please? Another approach that we've taken to inclusive storytelling is the new Chinese Grove It's an area of Kew that has plants and trees that were collected from China in the 19th century. You can see on the left-hand side that we've included standard Mandarin names for these plants on the sign, as well as a European common name and the Western scientific name. We've not removed or hidden the storytelling about plant collecting that happened in China, but we have added depth and richness to the history by acknowledging that China had a well-developed scientific, horticultural and agricultural understanding of plants before contact with the West. We have written in the text, the plant collectors therefore weren't discovering Chinese plants. So we've tried to shift the narrative around plant collecting to a more authentic and accurate place. Can I have the next slide, please? We're also looking at how our storytelling supports biocultural conservation, the conservation of cultural stories of plants. This is an image of a botanical specimen of Banksia serrata, collected by Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander at Botany Bay, as James Cook named it, in April 1770. Can I have the next slide, please? We have a variety of Banksia serrata called Superman in the Temperate House at Kew. During a recent exhibition on site by the artist Jan Hendricks called Paradise Lost, we added a panel to the specimen in which we acknowledge the impact colonisation has had on the peoples and ecology of Kamay, which is one of the Indigenous names for Botany Bay. We also added an additional orange plant label that acknowledges one of the Indigenous Australian names for Banksia serrata, Wirragayan, from the Gadigal peoples. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the ways that we can add richness to our storytelling is by adding the names of plants from their countries of origin. But it's actually quite a complicated approach in some cases. Many plants are cosmopolitan and occur across many countries. On the left here is a map of the 350 odd distinct Indigenous communities or language groups that occurred across the continent we now call Australia before invasion. Each of these groups has or had its own traditions, customs, laws, and this extended to the names for species. Sometimes a species would have several names depending on the season. Some of these names will be lost and some will be culturally inappropriate for us to know. You can see in the map on the right, which shows the distribution of Banksia serrata, that Banksia could pass through more than 30 different countries. So that's an enormous number of names that there may be for this plant. And Kew is currently in the process of working with partners who are putting together a project to uncover some of these names. And this is just one of potentially 24,000 species of plants in Australia, not to mention the 250,000 odd fungi that they may be in Australia. So it's a complex task. It's not always as simple as just finding another cultural name for a plant. Can I have the next slide, please? Then we come to priority 2, inspire people to protect the natural world. One of the big projects that sits underneath this priority is a revisioning of the iconic palm house at Kew Gardens. You can see it there in the image on the right. The palm house was built between 1844 and 1848. Excuse me, I just need a drink of water. And it contains a collection of plants from the wet broadleaf tropics of the world, including many plants of economic importance. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the plants that the palm house contains is sugarcane, which is represented at Kew Gardens in 2 locations. On the left, you can see a painting by Marion North, which sits at the moment mostly uninterpreted on the wall of the Marion North Gallery within Kew Gardens. And there is a clump within the palm house itself. So we have the opportunity to tell stories about sugarcane. You can see here pictured on the right, AJ Chahabra, and on the left, AJ's great-grandfather, Lali. AJ remembers visiting Kew with his mother and father, visiting the palm house and learning stories about his great-grandfather, Lali. Lali was transported from India to Fiji in 1904 to work as an indentured labourer in the sugarcane fields, back-breaking work for a young man of 14. AJ approached Kew and shared his stories about visiting the palm house with his mother and father to learn those stories about his family and the connections that they helped him establish back through the generations, back to Fiji and through Fiji into India. AJ now shares these stories in the palm house with his own children. AJ felt that if he worked with Kew to help tell those stories, that it might make members of his own community feel more connected to Kew and feel less of a barrier to coming to Kew and enjoying the garden landscapes and collections like the palm house. So we're increasingly at the very beginning of understanding how important these moments of connection are to our well-being, our identity and our sense of self. So we're working on a funding bid to extend that network around this project, to draw in more plants and more people from other places. We're really just at the beginning of this journey of understanding what equity, diversity and inclusion means for storytelling in the landscape at Kew. Can I have the last slide, please? This is a quote from a poet in Australia who I was speaking to about our talk tonight, and she wanted to send us this message. She said, "I'm with you in spirit as you speak, not to rewrite history, but to allow voices never heard to tell their stories, sing their names for seasons, trees, birds, the ancient web of all that can't be contained by a single word or science." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon, for your beautiful presentation. I see that there are as yet no questions in the chat. I'm sure they will come soon. I have actually, well, I have lots of questions that I could ask, but I'll just maybe ask a couple. I was wondering if you could maybe say something about what kind of challenges do you encounter to trying to tell more inclusive, more complete stories in the garden?
Okay, there's a couple of questions. There's a couple of challenges, really, and they scale up. The first challenge is a personal one, so it's being new to a new city and a new country and a new organisation. So there's those sorts of challenges. I think as an organisation, one of the challenges we have is, as I said, that there's not as much history of Kew already researched and written and published out there as certainly I expected. As part of the Decolonising Working Group, one of the methods that we used in looking at the history of Kew was, undertaking a literature review, as you would expect. And there are some very big books, some very important books that talk about Kew's history, but there are still a lot of gaps. So one of the strategies that the Decolonising Working Group will recommend is that more research is needed. So I guess we've done some valuable work in identifying what those gaps might be, which offers tremendous opportunity for students and scholars who, are looking to enrich their work with, an interrogation of Kew's history. Yeah. And I guess the last point would be making connections to community. So there are parts of Q that are very well connected to community. Our learning and participation team do extraordinary work with communities around Q, particularly with programs such as the Young Explainers program. So that's working with young people from around London who train and then develop programs that they then deliver in places like the Temperate House. So Q has these connections to stories. I guess it's about that becoming a two-way conduit. So really great storytelling starts conversations. So it's about fostering those bridges that allow those questions and those stories to flow backwards and forwards between Q and the community.
Thank you. And a small follow-up question within your answer. I was wondering also, you said that there's a relatively big gap in the knowledge about the history of Q. And I was wondering if in the process of putting more effort into researching those histories, if there will also be an engagement with the communities in the production of that knowledge that is necessary.
Indeed, there will be. So one of the sugarcane project that I've really briefly outlined, our aim is to seek seed funding so that we can extend that project and work with communities to develop that network. So that is seeking seed funding that wouldn't be operating at Q. That seed funding would go to the community groups. It would then resource them to help build that network. And that network would bring in community members, academics, students, scientists, historians. It would be a real interdisciplinary network. And so that will allow for the co-production of stories. It will also allow us to learn how you run that sort of network. In a sense, Q wouldn't be running the network, the community would be running the network. But we really need to experiment with how to do that successfully and authentically. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Jenna Smith. I'll just read it out. In its manifesto, Q declared that it would strive to increase the number of visitors from presently underrepresented communities to the gardens. Is Q succeeding in this? And what are the key factors in accomplishing this?
So Q is at the very beginning of establishing a strategy around the Manifesto for Change. Having said that, the learning and participation team, through their outreach work, particularly programs such as Grow Wild, has for any number of years been developing programs that build bridges that allow community groups that usually don't access to Q through programs. But I know that there's a renewed focus on that effort, but it's just at the very early days. I know that my colleagues in learning and participation are writing that strategy and working out how to do that, but the strategy hasn't been published internally yet.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question and then maybe we'll have a short break and then we continue. But I was also wondering, I mean, because of considering the history of Q and how it has involved a lot of different countries, I was wondering what is the role of international cooperation to make sure that the different stories that involve different communities from many different countries are being told or even being identified in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Sophia, and it's a really interesting challenge. The best example that I have of that is recently we wanted to tell a story about the Ebo forest. So an area where Q scientists supported the local community to create a conservation of that forest. So we're sitting at Q in London, the community is in Africa, but our scientists work in close partnership in country on projects. So we worked through our scientists back to the community, and there's a network and structure set up in the community, and said, okay, we want to tell this story at Q. What would you like to say? are you interested in contributing to the story? They were really interested in contributing to the story. And then we had a back and forwards by email where we, you know, they would write the story, we would show them what it would look like. They changed the story, changed the images, and then we produced it and put it up in the garden. So that's a very, very small example, but it was really exciting to work with people. I guess in 2020, we've all got used to working with each other online and not being so physically close. And in some ways, 2020 showed us that we can work in quite close partnership online and have an effective outcome. And so the interpretation went out in the garden, photographs were taken and sent back to the community, who were really thrilled with the outcome. Yeah.
Really nice to hear. There are more questions coming in now. I'm looking at Arjuna. Do you think we take a 5-minute break now and then we come back to the questions, or should we prolong the Q&A a little bit longer? What do you think?
Just 2 more questions.
Yeah, okay, I'll just maybe, let's see. The next one was from Emma Bell, and she says, I really appreciated your phrase, getting out of the community's way, or acting as a bridge for the community to tell its own stories. What are your thoughts on Q's responsibility to this bridge, that is education / raising interest and engaging with stories from communities which aren't one's own community?
Engaging stories from communities which aren't. So I think that's a really interesting conundrum, isn't it, and point. So this is the first time which I'll be in another place where I'm not in my own community, though there are many members of my own community in London. There are lots of Australians over here. All I can say is that working on this pilot project with AJ and learning about the Indian Fijian community in London, I am really just operating as a bridge to support AJ to work as a bridge for his community so that that story can be told through us and appear in the Palm House. So this is really about me providing AJ with the support, or not so much the support, he doesn't require support, it's more the mechanism by which that story can be told at Q. Really, the community has its own structures in place to gather its own stories. I really just need to help with, okay, these are the channels through which we can tell it at Q. If it's text and images, then the team that I work with can put it on panels. If you want the stories to be expressed through theatre or dance or film, then I would put the community in contact with my other colleagues. If it's a gigantic festival, then it would be the events team. So that's really my role in this. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll do a short break, and then and Emma says, right, sort of to facilitate use of the garden in the way that they want. Thanks so much. I guess that question was answered. I'll do a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 17. It's an odd time, but yeah, just a very short break, and then we can move on to Evie's presentation, and then we can come back to the questions that haven't been answered yet. I'll see you in a few minutes then.
Mute my audio. Okay. Okay.
Just wait until Sharon also comes back.
I'm here. I just turned off my camera.
Okay, I think most people are back from the very small break. I apologize for that. So we'll go on to Evie's presentation. Evie Evans is a culture and heritage professional working around how coloniality occupies our past, present, and future. She's currently part of Frame of Frame's Action Research Group, coordinating the decolonial presence strand of programming. Evie studied literary and cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam and completed a master's in museum studies. As part of her master's, she did an internship at Frame of Framed, assisting in the public programming for the exhibition on the nature of botanical gardens. Her master thesis, inspired by this exhibition, explores the colonial history of botanical gardens and their contemporary display, which musealizes plants. Evie, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you to Sophia also for inviting me and that really nice introduction. I'll just share my screen for the presentation. Okay. So yeah, like I said, thank you for inviting me, because it's really nice to be able to talk about this exhibition and have its topics and themes still be quite relevant today and hopefully still in the future. So Frame of Framed is a platform for contemporary art, visual culture, as well as critical theory and practice in Amsterdam. And the exhibition on the nature of botanical gardens opened last year in January. And yeah, I was an intern during that time, so I was able to work on it. And it's quite a unique exhibition for Frame of Framed, actually, because a lot of it came from in-house research. So in previous exhibitions, the people that worked there noticed that the colonial history, the cultural history of plants kept cropping up. And this became more focused research then onto an Indonesian perspective to kind of limit the scope. And that brought together this exhibition. And I think it's really important that it highlights the connection between botanical gardens and museums in terms of the way they show us ways of organizing, categorizing, and defining an unknown world from colonial times to the present. So the exhibition was curated by Cydia Boonstra, and she has said that it was mostly this decolonial approach that she chose was actually inspired by what a lot of these contemporary Indonesian artists were already doing at the time, and just kind of reflected what a lot of academics are saying already, basically. But I thought it would be nice to actually define what these decolonial approaches or narratives are, because I was also inspired by Q's kind of claim to decolonize their collections, which was published in an article in the summer last year, I think. But it's kind of hard to say, what does that mean to decolonize your collection? Because you can't really remove the colonial history that is already embedded in the object, even if it's obscured or it's not told. So it depends on how you address this. And I think contemporary art is a really direct way to reform these narratives and decolonize stories that we think we already know. So I kind of tried to summarize the exhibition in these 3 bullet points and these kind of decolonial approaches. So I think the first one is kind of to deconstruct our colonial or modern understandings, or our pre-existing understandings, whether that be with our relationship to nature or botanical gardens or museums. And this connection of the colonial and modernity is really important, from Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh's idea of decolonial praxis, because the history of colonialism is directly related to our idea of modernity, and these Enlightenment principles go hand in hand with imperialism. It's this kind of colonial logic. So it starts with recognizing that and maybe undoing that and saying, okay, this is not the only way it could be, which moves on to the next point of, in the case of nature, demonstrating indigenous notions or relationships. And these are kind of usually pre-existing ideas, which were then obscured or ignored by colonizers. And so it's really nice that Sharon was also able to share that this is, I think, something she already did in her work, kind of bringing these communities in and showing these new approaches. It's just about shifting your worldview to an alternative idea. And the last one is relationality. So I think this is a really important thing for botanical gardens and also decolonial work in general, because it's recognizing that everything is in a specific context. So this botanical history doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not just, these plants are nice, I'm gonna take them back to my home country to show everyone. It's really intertwined with imperialism and the movement, as Sharon already mentioned, of people, plants, and that's really important to kind of highlight, I think, hopefully for botanical gardens in the future. So I just thought I would pick out a few artworks that I think really exemplified these themes. And there's a lot more information on the Frame of Frame website. You can already find like the exhibition catalogs. And obviously, because this happened during the first COVID lockdown in the Netherlands, we had a lot of online programming for this exhibition. So there's a huge digital archive of interviews with the artist and the curator, and studio tours and things like that, if you want to know more. So this is kind of a big picture of the exhibition. This is in the space in Amsterdam Oost. And as you can see in the kind of in the front of the image, this distillation set, is an installation by artist Ada de Moine called Tuban. And his work was inspired by the 1995 book Aras Balik, and how the characters in the book used natural resources. So the artwork itself consists of these installation and distillation sets that actually use seawater from Tuban, Indonesia, which was sent obviously to Amsterdam. And these sets were turned on, the heat plates were turned on, and there were different natural resources in them. I think I can show a close-up image. So we had things like tea, lemongrass, nutmeg, peppercorns, kind of normal things. And these are heated, and in the space you get this lovely smell of all of the things. But it actually then drips down onto these books. And these were books produced by Suharto, who's one of, a dictator of Indonesia, who's president for over 30 years. And these books specifically had details about his New Order regime and like nationalist ideology. So the ingredients actually drip onto that. But I think what's important for this artwork in deconstructing our understanding of nature is that these ingredients are really just reduced to their use, the scientific use, and a very basic use and abuse of natural materials. And it also does well to highlight the global networks that already existed in the colonial period to transport these materials, because obviously a lot of them were sent from Indonesia to us in the production of this exhibition. And most of them could also be procured on Jabastraat, which is, a few streets over. So these networks were established then, and they're still existing now. Another work is Sinta Tantra's mural, which also is called an assemblage, called Kebun Raya, Kebun Saya. And this was inspired by the botanical gardens of Bali and Bogor. And the geometric shapes were inspired by the blueprints of these, the building plans of these botanical gardens. And she's kind of displayed art and artifacts together in a kind of museum style. You can see at the bottom shelf there was tea and teacups, also postcards and coins on a shelf. And I don't know if you can see, because sometimes the speakers might block it. There was actually a plant that was sent from Bali, which grew in the space and was on volcanic soil. And this artwork mostly explored botanical gardens as a site of leisure, which also means it was part of tourism and this exoticization of nature, and specifically Indonesia. So it really highlights, again, to deconstruct this idea we have of botanical gardens as, oh, beautiful neutral spaces, but they still have this history associated with them. This work as well is a video work by Life Patch, and they are actually an artist and activist collective, Indonesia. And this work was part of their ongoing research related to the colonization of the Batak tribe in North Sumatra. And they were researching these books called Pustaha, which are books that contain knowledge of medicinal herbs and traditional healing practices of the Batak tribe. And during the colonial period, a lot of these books were taken from Sumatra and ended up in the European archives. And I believe that some are still in the collection of the Tropen Museum. And while they were researching this, they couldn't actually have access to them. So in the video, the artists actually reproduce some of these healing practices, or the ones that they could find information for, and demonstrate the second theme of the Indonesian indigenous notions and relationships to nature. So it's just about an alternative approach, information that maybe in a Dutch context we wouldn't know, and provides a new perspective on different materials and plants. So for example, in the left video, there was kind of a recipe that involved turmeric root, which produced a drink that would help with period cramps, for example, which maybe is not quite widely known anymore. So this kind of lost knowledge is being revitalized. This work is by Samuel Indratma, and it's actually 3 parts. So there's this original painting in the middle, and then shadow puppets, and then a small animated video you can see at the bottom. And this artwork is really informed by Javanese beliefs and Hindu Buddhist beliefs. So for Samuel, there isn't really a distinction between human, nature, and animals. As you can see, the figures in the painting and the shadow puppets are not quite human, not quite animal, not quite plant even. But they all have human characteristics and traits, and are depicted also in the video, animated video, as having a soul and intention. And the video itself was a collaboration with high school students, and depicts the shadow puppets saving a burning forest. So it's a really nice artwork. It had some wonderful music as well. And this slightly blurry picture is Ziko Albaikuni's painting. This is actually a commission for Frame of Framed called Ruatan Tanah Air Beta, Reciting Rites and Sites. And I think this painting really exemplifies for me this idea of relationality, because in this single painting, there's really a representation of so many layered histories that are connected by the single site of the botanical garden. And so this is actually inspired by the Bogor Botanical Gardens. And the artist attended a traditional Sudanese ritual called Ruatan, which is a type of cleansing ritual by people who lived in the community. And so he was inspired by them to paint this, this work that also features, you can see the group of people on the left, because it's thought that this site specifically was already some kind of spiritual garden, kind of overflowing with nature. And then when the Dutch colonized this particular area, it became the Dutch Botanical Gardens. And also, I think it was also kind of the hub of colonial rule. It was like used as an office, kind of like that. And now obviously it's a public garden. So you have these different layers of the history coming through. And it references a lot of different sites and monuments, yeah, the local history. And all of these things, all of these different places in the garden are all happening at the same time. So I think that really shows that it's both a natural and a cultural space. And I think that's really what the next step for botanical gardens is, to show this cultural history as well as a natural history. So I thought that these would be kind of the first 3 steps in mind to think of where do botanical gardens succeed or fail in decolonizing themselves or their narratives, or where could they do that, just as a starting point, as something to think about. But it's really difficult to begin decolonizing botanical gardens when the colonial history is not always acknowledged, understood, or communicated to visitors. So these ideas really inspired my master's thesis, and to think of botanical gardens as museums, because I know that a lot of them are registered and recognized by ICOM, either as heritage sites or public institutions. And this also means they have to follow a code of ethics concerning their collections. But this doesn't necessarily mean you need to go down a whole rabbit hole of, oh, what is a museum? Like, what's the definition of a museum? It doesn't necessarily have to be that concrete. It's just recognizing the history of botanical gardens and museums, and even zoos, and this way of categorizing them have a similar history, and they come from a similar logic. But I also wanted to focus on the politics of botanical gardens being museums, and being these kind of institutions, which means they are subject to the same critique as museums are going through now, also with decolonizing their collections and debates around restitution. So if botanical gardens want to be recognized in this way, they also have deal with these issues, rather than being solely scientific institutions without this important cultural history. And so in my thesis in particular, I focused on storytelling. So it's really nice also to have Sharon talk about storytelling in her presentation, because if these are public institutions, then it's more a question about how they communicate themselves and their collections in a decolonial way to the public, and that's what needs to change. So like I said, rather than comparing the definitions of museums and gardens, it was more about the comparison between the processes of what is happening in the botanical gardens, these processes of knowledge and meaning making through narratives. So I took a kind of what I would like to call a museological approach, and focus on the idea of musealization. So the processes by which an object is acquired and is transformed into a source of knowledge and given representational value. And obviously in the case of plants, yeah, this is very interesting because I also saw someone's question earlier, connecting this to the debate surrounding restitution, because plants often get overlooked in that sense if they are more of a reproduction rather than an original object. But it's just something interesting to think about because, yeah, they are given this representational value, and they themselves can tell stories. So yeah, I wanted to think more about what are these narratives in botanical gardens and if their colonial history is part of them. So I just thought I would go through a few examples of these kind of moments that I noticed in botanical gardens, and I actually focused on greenhouses, particularly in Kew in London and in the Hortus, the botanical gardens here in Amsterdam. Also, just to limit the scope, because otherwise, you could be talking about these gardens forever, because especially Kew is ginormous. And I think for me, greenhouses are really kind of a symbol of imperial debris, which is an idea from Anne-Laura Stoller, because these are really Victorian relics, this idea of being able to transport and then grow plants that wouldn't survive normally in this type of climate. And the aim was really to try and represent the world, especially in the temperate house in Kew. Obviously, plants are divided by their origin from each plant kingdom. So this also has a colonial history attached to it. Just as a disclaimer, I visited these gardens last year, obviously, when they were open. So some of the information might be outdated, and Sharon already pointed out the ways in which Kew are then changing their information and their storytelling. So it might be a bit outdated, but it's also my own interpretation. So these are the themes that that I began my presentation with, and I just went through kind of examples of where Kew's temperate house specifically, because I didn't want to talk for too long, kind of show these ways or fail to do so. So Sharon already mentioned, but the temperate house was first opened to the public in 1863, and is the world's largest surviving Victorian greenhouse. So glass house, sorry. So it's quite old. And Kew itself actually, I think, really reflected on its own history in that aspect, but missed out this colonial element. So in thinking about changing our understandings of science or our understandings of nature, this colonial logic that is kind of the given now, I noticed that there was the scientific narrative, specifically in the temperate house, was really focused on the naming of plants and plant families. And this idea of, classifying them really supported Kew's environmental conservation work. So that was the main narrative, I think, in terms of the glass house. And the language specifically was really focused on plants being discovered. And so it's really nice that Sharon also shared that this kind of language is changing already, because within it you have a kind of linguistic imperialism. So it completely ignores the people who are already living there, who already knew about these plants, and also probably supplied a lot of information to Dutch and British collectors who were going there. So that's something that is now obviously changing in the gardens, but it's something to keep in mind also in other gardens. What are they calling these plants? How are they communicating to you where they're from? What is the scientific narrative associated with them?
Evie, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, just over the 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Just to let you know, we just want to make sure that we have time for the questions, because I already see some nice questions in the chat.
Okay. Yes, I will rush through. I definitely knew this was way too long, but I was hoping I could say everything. Obviously, inclusive storytelling, featuring these alternative worldviews that I mentioned before. I think this is something that Kew is already working on, as Sharon mentioned, but there's kind of hints of it in the temperate house. You can see that they had all these icons on their information labels about whether plants were used for food, or if they had any significant cultural meaning. So for me, that was like really interesting. I was like, oh, I'd love to know more, but then there wasn't enough information like that. So I think this is one step that could really show alternative relationships to nature and a cultural history for some of these plants, rather than just focusing on the bare biological bones, I suppose. a last point for relationality, where this to me was the most obvious example of where Kew could really advance, and hopefully other botanical gardens too. So this was actually in the Palm House, and had some rubber plants and just, you know, a little information about them and how they're used for a lot of things. But there's no indication of the history of how or why rubber would be in Kew in the first place. And I think it's a really good example because it shows rubber was actually smuggled from Latin America to Kew in 1876. And these successfully germinated plants were then sent on to Asia to be cultivated in plantations. And by the 1930s, the British, Dutch, and French plantations in Southeast Asia were producing 98% of the world's rubber. So here it only says this tree is native to Brazil, but most of the world's rubber comes from plantations in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia now. But there could be more information about, well, how did they travel? You know, they didn't just magically turn up in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. So it's all about this network, this global network, and the movement of plants and knowledge. I just included this because obviously Kew does have an art gallery and showcases contemporary art, and it was making me wonder if contemporary art is the only way to begin these conversations surrounding decolonizing collections and botanical gardens. But maybe that's just something to think about. I'll finish with this quote. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Evie, also for a really nice journey from the artworks in at Frame of Frame, and then to your thesis and your reflections on what is happening at Kew. And there are already quite a few questions. I'll dive straight into them. Mark Nesbitt says, great talk, Evie. I find the division between botanical gardens and museums very frustrating. It means that botanical gardens have missed out on big positive developments in the museum sector. Where do you think this resistance in botanical gardens comes from?
I'm not really sure, to be honest, because I was thinking about this today. And in my opinion, I don't think there is any shame in talking about the colonial history surrounding botanical gardens, because it is part of their history. And that's just something we need to acknowledge and discuss. There's no kind of, ancestral burden, but it is the way the world has developed and the world we are living in now. And I don't think it takes as much, I'm not sure. I don't think it would be as radical to include, even something as simple as these new information labels for plants having a few sentences that references specific instances of colonial history. So for me personally, because I'm already working on this, I don't know where the resistance comes from. I think it's maybe just a long history of always presenting the more the scientific information rather than also the cultural importance, because botanical gardens themselves are really important cultural institutions, and I think that isn't really discussed enough.
Thank you. And Saskia says that she would love to read your thesis, and she asks if it's available.
It's on the UFA Scripties website.
Maybe you could, I don't know, maybe we could still have time to put it in the chat, or you can maybe send it directly, or we can do that later on. And Caroline Deenhauser says, thank you for your talk, Evie. Your thesis seems really interesting. In the beginning of your talk, you used the terms decolonial and decolonized pretty much interchangeably. Do you think this was a decolonial exhibition or an exhibition that attempted to decolonize? Thank you.
That's a really great question. I think by virtue of it being a contemporary art exhibition in a cultural institution in Amsterdam and also not in Indonesia, I would say it was an attempt to decolonize. Yeah, I would say it's more about, it was more of a starting point of changing the way we think about botanical gardens rather than fully decolonizing.
Yeah, and to put also the topic on the agenda, I guess, because as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm not sure if I don't have all that knowledge about it, but it does seem to me, when I saw the exhibition Frame of Frame, I was lucky enough to be in Amsterdam, then I was also, yeah, it opened a lot of perspectives, I think, for me as well. So I guess, yeah. And I have a question from Kendra Evans. Such an interesting point about the rubber. Do you think there is space for an in-depth exhibition or space to explore relationality in more detail in this way?
I think so. I think it would be a lot of museums I know have kind of interventionist approaches, where I know, for example, the Amsterdam Museum a few years ago had more of an LGBT QI plus tour, where you could have an audio tour and go around to pre-existing things that were already in the permanent collection, but present a different point of view, which is one suggestion. But I think it would be a shame for it to be kind of a temporary intervention. I think it should be part of the narrative, because as I mentioned before, Kew Gardens, I think, has quite a lot of references and has a really strong narrative about their own history in terms of the Temperate House being built and the renovations it went through. So there is space, I think, to then talk about, okay, you know, these plant collectors worked for Kew and they brought these plants over, you know, this and this kind of insight into the imperial history, also connected to the British Empire. And I think that's something I quite particularly miss in the Hortus. I felt that there wasn't, for me at least, there wasn't enough of a narrative about the history of the site. You know, it's a really important heritage site as well. Mm-hmm. So even if it's, you know, this kind of meta narrative, I think that there is always space for that. But yeah, these things, again, also with Kew's new manifesto, these things always take a lot of time in big institutions.
Right, thank you. And I have a question here from Audrey, and I will not attempt to pronounce your last name. I apologize. I do not want to massacre your name. But and this question, I think, could be relevant for both Evie and Sharon. And it is that were 19th century Dutch and British plant collectors generally in competition, or was the collecting network a collaborative one with plant sharing?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the exact answer to that. I can't remember the name of the book, but there is a particular book written specifically about the history of plant collectors themselves, and it was actually an extremely dangerous profession to be in, because obviously a lot of people traveled to different places and got ill or, you know, died on the way there. So I would assume it was competitive, but maybe, I don't know, maybe Sharon knows more.
It's a great question, and I just, as you were talking about it, I was thinking to myself of the things that I've read. I've read stories of collaborations and I've read stories of competition. I haven't read very much about Dutch collectors at all, in fact, but across the plant collecting stories I've read, there's been cases of collaboration and competition and murder and you know, other elements. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that story of that connected network. I haven't thought very much about that, I must say. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't add any more to that.
Thank you. And Tamara van Kessel, I'm sorry for sort of moving around a bit in the chat. I'll still try to address all the questions, but Tamara van Kessel asked an interesting question, whether Sharon, you might want to comment on Evie's presentation, considering that Evie offers also reflection on the work that is being done at Kew.
It was a fabulous presentation, Evie. Thanks so much. And I'm really looking forward to reading your thesis. I think Evie's assessment of Kew is very fair. There are instances in the Temperate House where words like discovery were used. Some of those stories have changed. It was decided that the Temperate House would focus on, for its reopening, on stories about rare and threatened plants and Kew science. One of the challenges that we haven't addressed yet is how to add layers of storytelling. So one of the attempts that we made has not been very successful. So one of the strategies that we used was to have digital content, film and audio on our website with free Wi-Fi within the Temperate House and people being able to use their own devices to connect through to that additional content. But unfortunately, it's not working. We've tried additional digital content in a couple of ways around the garden, and we haven't quite yet cracked the mechanism of alerting visitors to that additional content being available and then them actually activating and digging into that additional content. I'm still hoping that we can solve that problem, and we can, as Evie has recommended, add additional layers, depth and richness to the storytelling, so that the Temperate House might be for a period about rare and threatened plants, but you might be able to follow those icons through to those other stories of human use or art or responses. So I guess our goal in creating that digital content was we wanted to create a community of interest. We wanted to develop some mechanism by which the storytelling became two-way. It seems to work really well in museum spaces. We haven't quite cracked how to do that in a garden space. And I don't have any research to back this up, but it's almost as if there are different modes and we haven't, our audience out in the garden are there with family and friends having a good time. When they go into the glass houses, I've observed their behaviour change and they seem to be more intent on learning, but we haven't really quite cracked that way. And we probably have lots of lessons to learn from museums, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. I'll ask a couple of questions that we didn't have time to ask before to you, Sharon. Sophie Sadenberg says, thank you for the great talk, Sharon. You mentioned in the Australian context that certain names for plants might be inappropriate to reproduce outside the original cultural context if one isn't a member of the community in question. I was wondering whether there are any similarities here with debates on the restitution of cultural objects which were not meant to be removed from their original cultural context, but ended up being removed from that context and displayed in museums in the West. Are there parallels here with botanic collections as well?
I think that there are some parallels, and reparation is something that Kew is spending a lot of time thinking about extremely carefully. In what does that mean in the context of being a botanic garden? I know that Kew is putting a lot of resources towards the digital reparation of knowledge and was involved in a project with a herbarium in Brazil. I'm just trying to think what the name of the project was. I think it was Reflora, and it was about providing information to the Brazilian herbarium. And indeed, botanic gardens around the world are putting a lot of resources into digitising their herbarium specimens and collections and making that knowledge available. And so I see that there's a strong parallel there. I guess one of the challenges is that the plants in some ways have become disconnected from their cultural stories in some instances. But one of the reasons why I'm so interested in biocultural conservation is that sometimes cultural knowledge has been accidentally embedded in the herbarium specimens. So in Australia, for example, researchers have found that some of the herbarium sheets, those sheets with the pressed specimens on them, might have on the labels or in the margins, if you like, it's like marginalia in books. The people collecting those specimens might have recorded Indigenous knowledge. And so I've always been interested in how we can reconnect that knowledge with the communities that it belongs to. So there are the parallels that I see anyway.
Thank you, Sharon. I see that we're almost running out of time. In 3 minutes, I was supposed to end the event. And I was wondering, I'd like to ask the speakers if you have time to take a couple more questions, or and it's okay if you choose not to, of course.
I think it's fine for me.
Is it okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Sharon, is that okay if we continue a few minutes longer?
Yes,
Great.
it's fine for me. Sorry, I got distracted by a question in the conversation.
No problem. I had a question here from Leonie. She said, and this is for Sharon, she said, thank you so much for the lovely talk. And she was wondering what forms the stories take. Is it tags? Is it audio guides? Maybe you can give a few more examples.
Sure. So at Kew, stories are told in a myriad of different ways, in all the different ways you would expect that they would be told in a museum. So there's panels, there's botanical labels, there's volunteers who deliver tours, there's a garden explorer that you can hop on and hear an audio tour, there's face-to-face interactions with experts, there's artworks in the gallery, there's interventions in the landscape where artists, there might be an exhibition of artworks. Over the last summer, we had the work of poets embedded around the garden. Kew has in the past experimented with QR codes linking to digital information or apps, and we're about to embark on the possibility of putting some digital screens around the perimeter of the garden or within some of the buildings. Certainly revisioning the Palm House gives us lots of opportunities to explore how we might tell stories in different ways in the Palm House. For me, I'm really interested in how we can build up and add lots of layers. There's a million different ways to tell stories. We've just got to find the ways that are really powerful.
Yeah. And I guess also the audience is also varied, so you need different kind of media to also speak to different people.
Indeed, yeah.
And I have a question from Elliot Levin for Evie. How do you think botanical gardens can go a step further past just acknowledgements so that they are not empty acknowledgements? Wait, sorry, I'll ask this question again. How do you think botanical gardens can go a step further past just acknowledgements so that they are not empty acknowledgements? A chance for reparations for these communities? I guess this Sharon also has a verse on the topic.
I think to avoid perhaps empty acknowledgements is more of a case in terms of language, or if it's not necessarily text, how it's presented and how it's communicated. But a chance for reparations for the communities is a little bit hard to say because, as I mentioned before, it's slightly different to restitution debates because it's more of a reproduction. There isn't the kind of same discourse about authenticity that there would be for other objects in museums. Maybe it's more of a case of conservation work in terms of different plants and being able to revive them in certain communities, or maybe it needs to be more work happening not in European botanical gardens, but botanical gardens in countries or places that were formerly colonized that then have more of this visible history. But this is also a question that I'm still thinking about.
Sharon, would you like to add something?
No, it's yeah, no, I don't have anything to add to that. It's something that I've been thinking about, but I'm not there yet.
I think it's a complex question, and I'm also not going to. Yeah, I'm really sorry, but I don't think I can pronounce your name. But someone just texted or just added in the chat. Very informative. Thank you. I think that refers to both talks. Just double checking that I didn't miss any question. Quick check. I think we covered all the questions. Sorry. Let's see. Yeah, we had a second question from Tamara, and that was early on for Sharon, Tamara van Kessel. She said, thank you for the clear and inspiring presentation. She asked, how do you approach the fluid boundary between cultural heritage and natural heritage? If I remember correctly, there's a pagoda in the garden, and she wonders if such an architectural object being narrated in combination with the natural heritage is an integral part of a colonial imagination.
Yes, indeed, there is a great pagoda in Kew Gardens, and interpreting the Great Pagoda is something that we're tackling this year in partnership with Historic Royal Palaces, which is the organisation that looks after the Great Pagoda, Kew Palace and Queen Charlotte's Cottage, which sits in the Kew landscape. There's a number of follies that still exist in the Kew landscape that date to the same period as the Great Pagoda and the palace. And we've been looking with HRP at how we might tell that story of the follies that are still there and those that are missing. But we also need to do some work on putting the Georgian Kew landscape into context. There isn't very much storytelling at Kew at the moment, apart from the Garden Explorer, the vehicle that you travel around on, that really explains the history of the landscape itself. Its changes through time, its different uses, the different landscape architects that impacted on the landscape. And obviously then there's the layer of how this was created through that period of empire and what that means, and what does the legacy that it's left, what does that mean? So we'll be working with HRP to figure out how to do that. I think it's a really fascinating story. I'm really interested in the landscape and how different ideas about what a botanic garden is through time, whether you can read those changes in the landscape itself. So that's something that I'm interested in pursuing about Kew. So if a particular scientist was interested in, say, grasses, does that mean that Kew has more of those grasses? But certainly the architecture, the cultural landscape at Kew has very rich stories to tell, as well as the natural landscape and the plants that inhabit it.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we've come to the end of the questions. I wanted to thank Evie and Sharon again for your lovely presentations and for all the really interesting questions. And I wanted to add as well, we're hoping to maybe at some point soon, or at some point in the future, potentially organize a second lecture on the topic, because hopefully Antonio Gouveia could still give his presentation. If anyone from the audience, if you have any kind of suggestions, or if you have interesting speakers that you think could be interesting to include in such a talk, we would welcome your suggestions. And I think you'll know where to find us. I believe the email that you use to register, you can also contact us through there. We'll be happy to receive suggestions. And I wish everyone good night or good evening or a nice day ahead. And thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Are we still recording, Arjuna? Maybe we can.
It's just to check all the names for the list.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I feel very bad if I can't pronounce someone's name, but I really, yeah, I need to.